Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. Regular viewers will know that we've been having some technical difficulties over the past couple of weeks. It's because we've introduced a new system. I promised you it just had to get slightly worse before it got better. Hopefully today it will be much better because for the first time in years, I'm joined in studio by Aaron Bastani. Lovely to be joined by you in person.
We're back, Michael. We're so back.
I'm so excited. I can smell you.
All the pain was worth it.
Coming up tonight, 28 of Nigel Farage's former schoolmates and teachers have said that they witnessed racist or anti-Semitic behaviour by Nigel Farage during the 1970s and 1980s. This has been an ongoing story. We haven't actually tackled it yet, so I'm very much looking forward to taking a bit of a deep dive into that. A video you might have seen on Twitter, very, very interesting. A CEO of a prediction market company who wants to profit from your opinions. He wants to financialize everything. I found this really interesting. We're doing a bit of a deep dive into prediction markets, why they're on the rise, what are they, should we be concerned, or are they going to be the best way that we can work out what's really going on in the world? That's the claim they're making. And we will discuss what parts of the economy should and should not be nationalised. It's partly a riff off an answer Zarah Sultana gave to first us and then Owen Jones. But it's not actually going to be a segment about Zarah Sultana. Lots of people have sort of been debating it in terms of, was it a strategic thing to say? I want us to have a more interesting conversation, which is what's actually correct. As ever, if you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. Allegations of Nigel Farage's extreme racism when a student at private school are not going away. 28 of his former schoolmates and teachers have now come forward to accuse Farage of anti-Semitism and racism, including apparent support for the Nazis when he was at Dulwich College. These included Peter Ettedgui. He's an Emmy and BAFTA-winning director who spoke to Good Morning Britain this week.
Well, he regularly would come up to me and say, Hitler was right. And he'd also come up to me and he'd go, gas them.
Are you Jewish?
Yes, I'm Jewish. I'm Jewish, yeah.
So he was specifically, you say, targeting you because you are Jewish with the most hurtful comments that someone can say to a Jew.
My German Jewish grandparents had escaped Nazi Germany in 1937. So I kind of grew up knowing about the Holocaust and everything that happened. So this, it was the first time I'd ever been targeted for anti-Semitic abuse in my life. I have to say it was also the last time. I've never remotely had anyone say anything like that to me.
How old were you at the time?
I was between the ages of 13 and 14. And I should add, that's why, because it was a long time ago and we were very young, when I was first approached to talk about this, back in 2013, I felt that it was an unfair thing to do. And it was only after Farage began denying it that I kind of thought, well, I've got to say something because there's no way that he couldn't remember.
So The Guardian has been publishing claims from other former students who have come forward about Nigel Farage. So someone who was in his year has claimed that when Farage was aged 17 or 18, he would make gas hissing noises at a Jewish boy. And this is a quote from that gentleman. He would make these gas hissing noises. He had this fascination with Hitler and the whole kind of Third Reich thing. And he had this fascination with basically gassing Jews. And he, as I say, whenever this lad went into the class, he would make these hissing noises, I suppose the lad being a Jewish student. Farage also apparently showed extreme animosity towards Asian students. This is from The Guardian again. The Guardian has reported on the claims of Andy Field, an NHS doctor, who said he recalled Farage burning a school roll in a year in which there were more Patels than Smiths. Richard Flowers came forward to say he also recalled Farage's response to the number of boys named Patel being higher than Smiths. He said, quote, "I remember him coming up to us holding the yearbook, which was like a pamphlet, and holding it open and sort of stabbing his finger at the name, saying, look, the most common name in this school has always been Smith, and now it's Patel, sort of thing, and sort of stabbing his finger at it. The Guardian has obtained a copy of the school roll for 1980, which shows that there were 12 Smiths and 13 Patels. A further former pupil of Asian background added his voice, claiming Farage was an open racist and would say Enoch Powell was right to him as a form of what he described as racial intimidation. Nigel Farage's response to these allegations was initially very defensive.
At school, categorically on the record, you did not racially abuse fellow pupils.
I would never, ever do it in a hurtful or insulting way.
That's not quite the same as not doing it.
It's 49 years ago. It's 49 years ago.
What difference is the time?
Isn't it? Well, I just entered my teens. Can I remember everything that happened at school? No, I can't. Have I ever been part of an extremist organisation or engaged in direct, unpleasant personal abuse, genuine abuse on that basis? No.
You're not quite, that's very, very caveated. You're not quite ruling this out. The question is, did you ever racially abuse fellow pupils in school? No. You've caveated it with a hurtful way.
Not with intent.
What do you mean not with intent? I don't understand what you mean by not with intent. What does that mean?
You wouldn't do.
But what does that mean?
No.
No what?
No. I have never directly really tried to go and hurt anybody.
And I mean, from that clip, that was the most uncomfortable I think I've ever seen Nigel Farage. He didn't seem confident. He wasn't making much sense to sort of say, well, I'm not denying I said these horribly racist things, but I didn't do it to hurt anyone. It wasn't intentional. But if you're saying that kind of stuff, I mean, we're going to discuss about whether this matters. Obviously, he was a teenager at the time. But, you know, he hasn't come out and apologised for it. Yesterday, Farage, though, I think sort of probably assuming he'd been a bit too defensive, looked a bit too shifty there. Yesterday, he went on the attack.
Let me say this to you. The double standards and hypocrisy of the BBC are absolutely astonishing. At the time I was alleged to have made these remarks, one of your most popular weekly shows was the Black and White Minstrels, right? The BBC were very happy to use blackface. Oh, and not just in the Black and White Minstrels, you did it in It Ain't Half Hot Mum as well. And what about Alf Garnett? Do you remember what he called Marigold? Do you remember the word he used to describe Marigold on not live, but on primetime national TV? I better not repeat the word, otherwise you'll all use it and say that I used it. Homophobia? It ain't half hot, Mum? Are you being served? Oh, and what about Bernard Manning? Perfectly happy at exactly the same time for Bernard Manning to appear on primetime national BBC comedy, telling jokes for which these days you'd probably get a knock at the door from our thought police and perhaps get a 31-month prison sentence. I cannot put up with the double standards of the BBC about what I'm alleged to have said 49 years ago and what you were putting out on mainstream content. So I want an apology from the BBC for virtually everything you did throughout the 1970s and 80s.
So, you know, a lot more forthright there. It seemed a lot more comfortable. That's sort of Farage in his comfort zone, isn't it? But there potentially has been a bit of a downside to him coming out, sort of sounding quite so confident. So there's a new story in The Guardian which broke just half an hour before we went live. And it's a man who, well, was a boy when he went to school with Nigel Farage, a gentleman called Yinka Bankole, who said that Farage said to him, "That's the way back to Africa." And actually, I think the most it'd be silly to say the most unpleasant, but the thing that made me go, whoa, is that at the time, Farage was 17 and this kid was 9. So this man said, "I went to the school for a year between 1980 and 1981, starting at a mere 9 years of age. I was in the most junior class. My hard-working parents celebrate with pictures, yada, yada, yada. It took a while, I recall, but one day Farage and at least one other spotted me in the lower school playground. He was about 17 years old. He towered over me. 'Where are you from?' he asked. Within seconds of offering my rather confused and sputtering answers, he had a clear response. 'That's the way back to Africa,' with an accompanying hand gesture pointing towards a far away place. And then he said," so this gentleman is now 54, he's an engineer, said that once his existence as a target was established, Farage would wait at the lower school gate where I was dropped off for school so as to repeat the vulgarity. He said he would always remember what he described as a look of hatred he had for me, seemingly simply for existing, without knowing my name, but just looking at me with what appeared to be no appreciation of my humanity and simply because of how I looked. Farage, well, what has Farage has denied he did any of this in a malicious way, and I suppose, I don't know to what extent he denies sort of these particular allegations. I suppose he says he can't remember lots of them. Aaron, how much does this matter? Because obviously, one of the reasons we didn't cover this story for a while is because I do think that in general, you shouldn't really hold people to account for what they did as teenagers, because we're just so different as teenagers. At the same time, if you do want to become Prime Minister of a country, people do want to know your backstory. They want to know where you're coming from. What are you about? You know, what has driven you into politics? What kind of person are you? And if you were doing all of this between the ages of 13 and 17, 18, which isn't, you know, he's pointing out that this was a different age, that there was sort of casual racism on the BBC, which there absolutely was. But it does seem like he went beyond sort of casual racism, sort of hissing at Jewish people, sort of to evoke gas chambers. There does seem to be something more serious going on here. So can he brush it off as this was 49 years ago?
Well, there was casual racism on the BBC. That's absolutely true. But in the case of Till Death Do Us Part with Alf Garnett, he was a parody of a racist. And so Nigel Farage, allegedly at this time, was saying the same kind of thing as Alf Garnett, which was effectively a satire. And the whole point was that he was the butt of the joke. Marigold was highly intelligent. His daughter would, take the mick out of him. His wife, had enough. The long-suffering wife. And I never thought I'd see the day, Michael, when Nigel Farage was calling upon the BBC to apologise for Alf Garnett. Probably one of his intellectual and political and ideological heroes. It should be said that Farage has insisted that large numbers of young men at the time that he studied with at Dulwich College have got in touch with him. They've said, we send our sympathies, this is outrageous, it's a personal attack on you. But all of the information you just relayed there, the names, for instance, people looking at the role in the appropriate year, it kind of adds up. And I wonder, you said it when we were off air for a moment, so I'm going to steal your line. Sorry, Michael. When Farage was being defensive, you said, that reminds me of Corbyn. That reminded you of Corbyn when he was at his most defensive, when he was kind of ad-libbing it, winging it, not really sure of his political position. The same thing applies with Farage as Corbyn. This is going to sound so strange, but it's true. The bad presentation is an outgrowth of the uncertain politics. Farage doesn't know what his political position is here. The minute he does, he'll choose a line, but I don't think he's done that just yet. He tried to do that by going on the offensive. What else can he do? I do think there was another option, which he's obviously chosen not to pursue, which is just to say, I said some of those things. I really apologise. I was a teenager. We all change. I suspect they've made some kind of calculation that won't work, but we're still maybe 3.5 years out from a general election. I'm kind of surprised he didn't do that, because this will now just go on and on and on. And one thing it does do is it undermines attacks by reform on people like Labour when it comes to things like anti-Semitism. They just lost that card to call the Greens or to call the Labour Party or to call Jeremy Corbyn anti-Semites, because there are reputable news sources saying that he made hissing noises at Jewish pupils while at school. On this, I think reform are really in a 2 and 8. And one thing it does mean is that it's very hard for them now, ahead of the next general election, to say to the Greens, to say to your party, to say to Labour, oh, you're anti-Semites because you're recognising a state of Palestine, or you're campaigning on this issue of Gaza. The line that all of them can say, from Martin Ali to Keir Starmer, even to Ed Davey, is, hold on one second, you're the man that is reported to have said to young boys at school various things, and you hissed gas noises to fellow Jewish pupils. So I think it's a huge deal.
And do you think it matters? So obviously there's a question of, does it matter politically? Will it affect the next general election? And then there's also the question of, what does it say about the possibility of Nigel Farage getting into power? Because we've had conversations on this before. I had one with Helena about, whether Trump's a fascist or whether Nigel Farage is a fascist. I think, the disagreement we were both having is, we said Trump is definitely very open to fascism, sort of in terms of the things he says, in terms of his attitude to democracy, in terms of his attitude to race and things like that. He's clearly very comfortable with it. my argument was that doesn't mean America is now in a fascist moment, because sort of maybe the structural conditions aren't there. Anyway, that was a different conversation. But what we both seem to agree about Nigel Farage is that he wasn't really a fascist. You know, he is a right-wing populist who wants to reduce immigration, but doesn't seem to be a white supremacist, let's say.
All right.
And should this give us pause? Should this make us a bit more worried that actually the root of this guy's politics is not just sort of a right-wing populist aversion to too much immigration? It is genuine, sort of real far-right fascist racism.
But isn't that where they all come from? If you look at, for instance, National Rally in France, right, the old man who started it, I think he's 99 now, you know, they might win that presidential election precisely because he's no longer on TV screens, right? So the genesis of all these populist far-right, most of them, some of them are actually still overtly fascist, some of them came from explicitly fascist organisations, like in Austria, and actually in France too. But the genesis of most of these organisations in Europe on the new radical right is from precisely that place. Nigel Farage, if he does change his tune on this, might say, look, I said that stuff 45 years ago, 50 years ago, whatever. I don't think it anymore. And maybe that's partly true. But I do also think that having Zia Yusuf there does give him something of a firewall. You know, I think he's the head of policy right now. He gives him something of a firewall when it comes to claims of bigotry, because he's not just not white, he's not just brown, he's also a Muslim. And I do think that's part of the reason, I do genuinely think that. I think he admires him in terms of his ability, but I do also think that's part of the reason why Farage fought so hard for Zia Yusuf to remain at the top of reform.
And it is also the case, I mean, us saying you shouldn't really judge someone by what they did as a teenager. I think obviously he has questions to answer here, but the fact that he was a white supremacist when he was a teenager doesn't necessarily imply he is one now. You know, like Keir Starmer was a Trotskyist, wasn't he, when he was a student?
Maybe so. Peter Hitchens thinks he still is.
I think probably Keir Starmer isn't much of a Trotskyist now. I think people's politics do change, and they often do moderate. So, I mean, yeah, I think people are right to be concerned that this is what Nigel Farage said when he was a kid. I think it is difficult to say it tells us that much. I don't think you can say he's a white supremacist because of what he said when he was 16.
But if he's not being honest about it, isn't that the big deal here, right? If he's lying about, which maybe he is, maybe he isn't, it appears that he is being deceptive.
Yeah.
If he's not being honest about the bigoted things he said as a 17-year-old, the inference would be, well, he's trying to conceal actually views he held for much longer than that.
Yeah. I believe all of these reports. Also because what you'd need, you know, if you have changed, you need to be able to tell that story. If he was a white supremacist and now he's not, when did he stop?
Right.
What persuaded him that actually Britain is great as a multi-ethnic society? Because I suppose he's always made the dividing line. Look, my issue is immigration. Sometimes he's made the issue Islam or whatever. But he said, I've always been against the BNP, where it was about race. I've always been against the EDL. And he's sort of tried to build that firewall between himself and the more explicitly racist far right to say that he's something different. And if clearly, I mean, I believe basically all of these accounts, that they seem too consistent with each other. Too many people are saying it. His denials are completely implausible, in the sense that the idea, yes, I said them, but I didn't say them with malice. It just doesn't stack up when you've got all of these accounts from people. So I do think that unless he can demonstrate this is how I changed and why, and this is the evidence I changed, yeah, that is very worrying that this is the favourite to be the next Prime Minister.
Can I say one more thing? I think it was yesterday, right? It was reported that the single biggest donation by a living individual to a political party in British history was to Reform. Isn't that extraordinary? I think it was £9 million.
9 million,
right?
yeah.
£9 million was given to a political party led by a man who's now allegedly got this in his past. But that's the key point. He's not willing to accept it is what happened. He's now changed. He's been on, quote unquote, a journey. That's where big money is going. That's where corporate interests are going. I think that says something really important.
Let's go on to our next story. I mean, we might be coming back to maybe at some point Nigel Farage. You know what, actually, just before we go on to our next story, I don't think we know that much about Nigel Farage. Do you know what I mean? It feels like he's due a big biography or a big documentary series, because he is like a seriously, he could be the next Prime Minister. And I feel like even as, I suppose we could go away and do loads of research on Nigel Farage. Obviously, I've got lots of things to read about every day. But as a country, I think people still see him as the guy down the pub. The journey is still unclear, and I think that story needs to be told. So I can imagine, especially also, if someone makes a really glossy documentary about Nigel Farage, where lots of these claims are being made by, the people who suffered from it, and then they can tell a story whereby there's no evidence he changed. What was he doing in his 20s, for example? I don't really know. Because this is what he was doing in his teens.
He was a metals trader.
He was a metals trader.
But, one thing, some people in the comments will be saying, nothing sticks with Farage, he's Teflon, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if he wants to win 20% of the vote, right? But if you're talking about winning a parliamentary majority of 100 plus, and he's trying to get, let's say, 30% of the vote, actually it does matter. Actually, you do need to get some brown and black people, which, by the way, Reform are getting them right now. I've spoken to many of them. Many of those people voted for Leave in 2016. So you really can't dismiss that. If you want a big parliamentary majority, this stuff will matter. Farage knows that. That's why he looks and sounds the way he does. It's very, very, very shaky territory for old Nige.
This is a bizarre video from the co-founder of Kalshi, which is a prediction market. We'll go into what that means later. Let's first look at the clip, which has gone viral on Twitter this week.
Mark, you've mentioned multiple times that you think prediction markets will be bigger than the stock market. What is it going to take to become a $1 trillion asset class?
It's pretty much already like close to $100 billion a year of asset class, right? It's pretty easy to imagine a 10x from here. We haven't even started. It's been a year. I think a very large number of people care, much larger than traditional markets. And I think retail as a pie has just been growing in the US, and I think it's going to keep growing. It's growing in the stock market, but it's growing outside of the stock market. The long-term vision is to financialize everything and create a tradable asset out of any difference in opinion.
So that was Tariq Mansour, co-founder and CEO of Kalshi. It's basically a betting website, actually, but you can bet on political events. So the quote there that I think sort of outraged everyone was him saying, the long-term vision is to financialize everything and create a tradable asset out of any difference in opinion. I can't really imagine a more dystopian sentence. We'll talk about that in a moment. First of all, though, this did pique my interest in prediction markets, how they could possibly be bigger than the stock market, which is what he seemed to be suggesting could be in store in the near future. So Kalshi, which is that gentleman's company, describes itself as a prediction market for trading the future. That's sort of the tagline on their website. This is what you see if you go on their website. So all sorts of things you can bet on: the next US presidential election winner, will the Fed change interest rates in December? As you can see, there's $21 million betted on the Fed decision. Still only $4 million on the next US presidential election, but that's in quite a long time. And then you've got things like, will Trump release any of the Epstein files? And then you always have an end date. So if you've said no or yes, then it cashes out when the deadline comes. So there's loads and loads of people investing on, to be honest, most of their money I think comes from sports betting, but then lots of the I suppose the publicity comes from the betting on political events. The more famous prediction market, the one I'd heard of before this week, is Polymarket. So this is what's on Polymarket's website at the moment. So $13 million has been bet on whether Elon Musk tweets between 240 and 250 or 260 and 270 tweets. So you can see what's going on here. Will Maduro be overthrown? Sort of all these different events that may or may not take place in the world by a deadline, and you vote whether or not it will happen. And obviously, if you get it right, you win back some money. Prediction markets are big business. So Polymarket and Kalshi basically came from nowhere at the start of 2024. But in the week running up to the US election last year, there were almost $2 billion worth of bets placed in a single week. Bets subsided after that, as you can imagine, but there's now $1.2 billion worth of weekly bets on Kalshi and $1 billion, again, weekly on Polymarket. So that adds up to a lot of money. As you can see, this is a growing industry. It's making its founders a lot of money. So Kalshi is currently valued at $11 billion, which has made its co-founder, former ballerina Luana Lopez Lara, into the world's youngest self-made billionaire. Not everyone is relaxed about this surge in activity, though. The Bank of America last month warned that gambling on prediction markets was creating new credit risks, as reported in Bloomberg. You can see here, they warns, this is the Bank of America, that the negative financial effects of these wagers may be most pronounced for low-income consumers and especially for young men. Easy access and gamified interfaces encourage frequent and impulsive wagers, wrote a Bank of America strategist or strategists. For investors, this convergence of entertainment and speculative finance signals heightened behavioral risk that could pressure credit quality, increase delinquencies, and impact earnings for issuers and some prime lenders. This is a tale as old as time. You don't really need very sort of expensive analysts to tell you that when people gamble, they're more likely to go into debt or not pay back their debts, as with any form of gambling. Some participants, though, are making a killing. 60 Minutes recently did a report on Polymarket.
I don't think of myself as a gambler. I'm taking very, very well-researched views on things. I feel like it's much more akin to investing.
Betting is Domer's full-time job. He said he made nearly $3 million last year on Polymarket. He used to be a professional poker player, but gave it up. Prediction markets, he says, are more exciting.
Every day I'm kind of going into battle.
You wake up, you drink coffee, and you're in battle.
You are wrong. I look at my phone within 5 seconds of waking up. What have I missed? My phone is my coffee. What has happened overnight? Yeah. Because the news doesn't sleep.
Did you bet on the papal conclave?
Yes, for sure.
A papal conclave is a hermetically sealed environment. Information does not get out.
Right.
Nobody was putting money down that there'd be an American pope, but you were.
Yeah, and his odds were 250 to 1. So he was a super, super, super long shot.
He won $100,000 on the Pope, and even more picking J.D. Vance to be Donald Trump's running mate. He started betting on him 5 months before he was selected, when Polymarket was only giving Vance a 2% chance. What did you see that made you think, he might pick J.D. Vance?
So that goes back to 2016 when he picked Mike Pence. And buried in one of the articles for why he picked Mike Pence is that Mike Pence had a one-syllable name. And Trump has a one-syllable name. And Trump is very into marketing. And so I was looking at the names and I was like, who is one syllable? And not only is Vance one syllable, he's only 2 letters off of Pence.
So you bet $4,000 and you ended up winning $250,000?
Yes. Yeah.
It's a smart play.
It is a good bet. Yeah.
The fact that people are putting their money where their mouths are means that many people actually consider these markets to be a better predictor of political outcomes than polling or expert analysis by any one individual or company. You get the wisdom of crowds, and also you get people who, there's actually feedback based on whether their decision is or their prediction is correct or not. And Polymarket did win kudos for correctly predicting, or for protecting the probability as implied on Polymarket suggested that Trump would win the US presidential election while polls were still calling it a dead heat. And that's one reason why media companies are now striking deals with prediction markets. So this is a tweet from Kalshi. CNN partners with Kalshi to integrate prediction markets into its global newsroom. The first major news network to embrace Kalshi prediction markets. A new era of media is here. Now, that was tweeted on Wednesday, so it said this is the first announcement. Less than 24 hours later, Kalshi's second major media link-up was announced. The company put out this accompanying video.
And I'd like to welcome you to the most significant programming effort, the Consumer News and Business Channel, CNBC.
We'll take you live to the floor of the New York Stock Exchange.
Microsoft carrying the world literally all night.
There's a lot of stuff that's .com that's going to be .nothing 6 months from now.
This is the big, hold on everyone, we've been waiting for this.
I think we're at the bottom. I really do.
Obviously is. I think Kalshi now.
Kalshi.
The idea of building the most important financial market on the planet, you see it with the mayor race 2 days ago, and people joined for that mission, for building that financial market.
The Kalshi odds that have our chances of victory in the 90s.
So the argument there, it used to be that there were these analysts who would sort of say we're at the bottom of the market. Now people can just say, well, Kalshi says we're at the bottom of the market, and that will be better because there's the wisdom of crowds, yada, yada, yada. What really struck out to me from that video, though, was the tagline at the end, if you're listening on podcast, you won't have seen it, which was tomorrow's headlines today. And what that immediately reminded me of was Tomorrow Never Dies, the James Bond movie. Have you seen it?
I have, of course I have, yeah.
So in that movie, if you haven't seen it, that's where you've got a news company kind of based on Rupert Murdoch who is making big world events happening so that they can be the first to report on them. And their tagline was tomorrow's news today. So are we worried that people are going to make big bets on political outcomes and then go to great lengths to make those political outcomes happen? Is one question. But I'll throw to you for the broader discussion. What do you make of these prediction markets?
So you saw CNBC there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Another partner is CNN. CNN was the world's first ever 24-hour news channel. First ever. Started by Ted Turner. Great guy. Progressive figure in the US. Really interesting politics. He used to be called the Mouth from the South. Really gobby guy. I think he owned a basketball team. He was just a really big character. Democrat. I think he paid off America's debt to the United Nations at one point. He just paid it off himself because he was like, this is embarrassing for our country. Really interesting guy. And I feel that he's a bit like in Terminator 2, you know, Miles Dyson, the guy who inadvertently creates the Terminator. He creates Skynet and they have to kill that dude. And he's like, why are you trying to kill me? It's like, you're responsible for ending mankind. I feel like Ted Turner, a very good man, he's still alive, progressive figure. When he started a 24-hour news channel, he began something which we still haven't really got our heads around. If you look at social media, X, all of it, it's based upon the rhythm and the method and the dynamics of 24-hour news. So that's from 1980. And now they're partnering with 24-hour gambling, 24-hour addiction, 24-hour attention. Humankind has built a planetary exoskeleton, which is what they are, 5G satellites, right? We built a planetary exoskeleton, all kinds of satellites, in order to create hundreds of millions, if not billions, of addicts addicted to social media. I'm addicted to social media. Maybe you are. You're a pretty good guy, actually, on that front. Addicted to social media, addicted to gambling, addicted to pornography, addicted to online retail. Addicts, addicts, addicts. We've built this exoskeleton for addiction, adverts, attention. I think, given the miracle of the internet, and by the way, it is a miracle, you know, maybe we could do something slightly better than betting markets for how many tweets Michael Walker is going to put out between January and February 2026. I must also add, though, looking at some of that stuff, I'm thinking, you know what? I wouldn't mind that. 20 quid punt on who's going to be the Metro Mayor for, you know, Hampshire. Oh, that's not happening now, is it, till 2028? I'll do it in 2028. So I can see the allure of it, and I'm not diminishing that. That's very real. But this says something really big about where we are with capitalism. And people use that term late-stage capitalism, right? I don't generally like it because who knows what stage we're in. But it does feel kind of weird. I just want a country that makes stuff and builds stuff. I look at China, I'm thinking, let's do more of that. I don't want 24-hour betting, you know, sites working with news organizations that I can just access within 5 seconds of waking up. That feels to me like a dysfunctional political and economic model.
So I suppose there's two, like the link up. I mean, I agree with you. You know what I think about smartphones and everyone having these sort of attention suckers in their pockets. But the link up, I suppose, can be in two different ways, which is, I suppose, what happens with sports and sports betting is you watch the sports and then the sports betting company sponsors the sports channel so that you're watching the football, and then in the adverts you're thinking, I'll place a bet.
Yeah.
And so both parties are winning because they're getting sponsorship money.
That's really new, though,
and
to be clear.
Yeah, and then Bet365 or whatever, they're getting your money because you're gambling on the game. So this could be sort of CNN saying, we've just shown you our analysis of the elections, and then a big advert comes up to say, who do you want to bet on? Maybe you could now bet on the American presidential election. I think what they're trying to present it as is that these prediction markets are a new, genuine, useful tool in terms of predicting the future, just in the same way that, you know, the Times has a link up with YouGov. And I'm sure CNN has a link up with a particular polling company. Definitely a lot of them had link ups with 538, didn't they? Nate Silver's company. So they'd say, this isn't us trying to encourage our audiences to bet on the political events we're talking about. It is us using this prediction market as a tool of better informing our viewers as to what is likely to happen in the coming months and years.
Two things. Isn't that bad? I want somebody to think for themselves. Oh, I would like this person to lead the country, therefore I will vote for them. Instead, where we've been for the last goodness knows how long. Well, all the polling says that this guy can't win and this person's not electable and that policy is really unpopular. Well, something's unpopular until it's popular. Leaving the European Union wasn't a popular policy position. It certainly wasn't a majority position in 2000. It was by 2016 because people campaigned in a democratic way. You can say there was ups and downs and maybe some people said some things which weren't true. But that's the process of democracy. That's the first thing. Secondly, there are huge incentives for media organizations, news organizations to jump on this. You're absolutely right. You should care about the news because you should care about politics, and you should care about politics because you should care about who's governing you, right? You don't have the luxury of not caring about politics because, as I think it was Plato, maybe it was Aristotle that said this, if you don't care about politics, well, you better get used to stupid people governing you. And I feel like that's the reason why people should care about politics, because they care about their own lives and the context in which their lives unfold. And instead, you've now got CNN and CNBC saying, no, you should care about politics because it means that you can bet on stuff, right? It'll give you a little dopamine hit to bet on Gavin Newsom beating J.D. Vance at the next presidential election. No, an American should care about that race because it's going to impact their life in really meaningful ways. That's literally what politics is meant to be. People should care about politics because it has meaning on their lives, not because they're going to make a $20 margin on betting on this guy rather than that guy.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the case for it, or the case for taking betting markets seriously, let's say. Have you read Super Forecasting by Philip Tetlock?
I've breezed over it. I haven't read it.
It was made famous because Dominic Cummings sort of asked all the civil servants to read it. But it is very interesting. And basically, his argument is to say, so sort of his initial research was into political judgment. So he, did a study where he'd sort of go around and ask all of these political scientists, all of these columnists, to sort of make predictions about what's going to happen in the future. And he said they were kind of worse than if you were just, I think he says, sort of like a monkey throwing a dartboard or something. They had no bearing at all with reality. It's not that they were actively wrong, they just weren't any sort of better than if you just flicked a coin or if you just asked anyone on a street corner. And his argument was that this isn't because these people are stupid, it's because in the political commentary industry or in academia, there is no accountability mechanism whereby you really need to be right. Sort of what you need to do is you need to tell a convincing story to your audience. When it comes to political media, often you've got to tell a story that your audience already agree with, because you want to keep them happy. And so he's saying that means that there's sort of no relationship between this whole industry of political expertise and reality. And what he does is he sets up these sort of prediction competitions. They sort of do them in the American intelligence community, where he says that this means that you have some accountability. Lots of political, like Matt Iglesias does it on his Substack now. At the end of the year, he sort of makes a bunch of predictions with percentages and then says that's keeping him accountable because at the end of next year, he can judge how he did. I do think there's something to it. I think it's interesting. We'll talk about that in one moment, but let's first go to the owners of these firms, who are kind of saying or the argument I'm putting forward, they're saying is true, right? So they are, of course, they don't want to say we're just making everything into a betting machine. We're not just out here to make money. They're saying this is a useful project which in some way can further humanity. This is the CEO of Polymarket on 60 Minutes.
It's a site where you can basically bet on current events. Some sort of question about the future, like an election. And as a result, when a ton of people are betting, you get the betting odds, which basically tell you how likely each outcome is.
And how accurate is it?
It's the most accurate thing we have as mankind right now, until someone else creates some sort of super crystal ball.
Another clip now from the other CEO. So this is another part of the original clip we showed you, Tariq Mansour, Kalshi's CEO.
We are living in a world where we have an abundance of information, but there's a lot of noise, and we don't really understand what's real from what's not. And prediction markets are an antidote to that. They do a very, very good job at distilling information and surfacing truth to people. And you're seeing this sort of massive shift where people are using them whenever they think about questions about the future, whenever they're debating about anything. And I think that trajectory is going to keep going.
Just one more point before I go to you. This kind of reminded me of something that Gary Stevens had said in an interview to you before, where he was saying the one thing he liked about the trading floor compared to the economics department at Oxford is you got respect if your predictions came true. Whereas at a university or on the pages of a newspaper, you get respect if you can spin a good story. And so, well, I mean, I think these things should probably be regulated out of existence because I just don't like gambling in general. And I think there's just lots of sort of potential avenues for insider trading, corruption, that I think probably the negatives outweigh the positives. But I also do take seriously the idea that when people are putting their money where their mouth is, they will have a different approach to predictions than columnists, than YouTubers, than academics. I suppose I have a lot of skepticism when it comes to sort of the epistemology of political analysis.
100%. Put your money where your mouth is, as they say. 100%. When Gary said that to me, you know, he was saying that, look, Robert Peston or this or that pundit can be wrong 10 times out of 10, and it doesn't matter. If I'm wrong once or twice, I'm out of the door. And that's true. And another thing he said, which really sticks in my mind, is the best economists on earth are people you've never heard of and you'll never meet, because they're working for very, very valuable organizations, the most prestigious banks, investment funds, asset managers in the world, and they're making them a ton of money. The information they have, the insights that they have are extraordinarily valuable. Why on earth do you think they would give it to you for free? Why would they do that? So instead you get the dross, you get the slop. Now, of course, you know, the BBC and ITV and Sky, they say, we're not the slop, we are the elite, we're the real information, right? And I think he's absolutely right. That is not the real information. The real information is what's informing prices and resource allocation. We have no idea what's going on because it's being done by people who don't talk in front of a camera, right? And that's one of the great things about Gary Stevenson. It's why he now has 1 million followers on Instagram, 1 million YouTube subscribers. So that's true. That's true. If we were just having betting markets on certain things, I possibly wouldn't even mind. My big problem, I've got 2 big problems, just to be clear, just to repeat what I said a moment ago. And I know you don't like repetition, so I'll be quick. One is the addiction thing. But secondly, how does this frame politics, Michael? You know, already because of capitalist realism, the realm of possibility is so constrained by elites. This person isn't, Trump wasn't electable, right? That's what the entire establishment determined until he won. Mamdani, not electable until he wins. You see this time after time after time, you know, after time. Henry Ford had a great quote. If I gave the market what they wanted, I would have made a faster horse and cart. He invented the car. Nobody could have predicted the car because it wasn't building on what was already there. It was a genuine innovation. So, yes, I see the place of these. Maybe in some respects it'll be better than legacy media because it will reward people who are correct. But at the same time, I think it's going to have really negative consequences for how we consider the future. How do we conceive of the future? How will it be different to today?
Have you know, we're going to move on to our next story in a moment, but just to pick you up on, is this a legacy media problem? Because I think it's potentially even worse on YouTube. Because I think probably the biggest cognitive bias is saying what your audience want to hear.
Audience capture.
Audience capture.
It's slightly different, but it's also a problem, right? And lots of new media have the issue of audience capture. A lot. And you know, the nicest thing that people say to me, and maybe people are watching this going, I hate Aaron Bastani. The nicest thing people say to me is sometimes I have no idea what you're going to say on something. And that's important. If I know, if there's a pundit, or there's a thinker or a YouTuber or a podcaster, and I know exactly what they're going to say on any given position, why on earth would I watch them? They're not going to make me think. I love engaging with people who I disagree with on, say, 80% of stuff, and then 20% of the time they really make me think. For me, those are the most valuable people to engage with. But you're absolutely right. The idea that independent media, and we're part of that, and I don't think we're subject to audience capture, but you know, it's there for any organization in new media for sure. Audience capture is a real thing. Do I think it's as bad? I don't know, Michael. It's easy to forget how bad legacy media's coverage was of Labour for the 2017 election, or its treatment of Trump. You know, they genuinely thought before 2016 it was a physical impossibility. It was like trying to defy gravity for Trump to win. You know, HuffPo famously gave him a 3% chance of winning. This is an election between 2 people. Any reasonable betting market would say, well, that's an outlandish series of odds to give. So, yeah, of course, legacy media has problems, new media has problems, but I think in new media, if you're wrong consistently, you get punished a heck of a lot quicker than if you're at the BBC or the FT. There are some people, I won't name names, they've been wrong about pretty much everything for the last 25 years, and we all get things wrong. They've been wrong about pretty much everything for the last 25 years, and they still seem to be on BBC Question Time and writing the op-eds and the leader articles for some of the biggest papers in the country.
On a Friday, I often like to use the opportunity of having my time with Aaron to take a break from the news cycle and tackle some fundamental questions. And we've got a big one today. Capitalism versus communism, liberalism versus socialism. There's lots of nuances. We'll draw these out. First, though, this isn't going to be a segment about Zarah Sultana. We've done a few of those recently. But a big debate along these lines was set off this week by a couple of comments made by Zarah at your party conference. So we'll start with Zarah's conversation with Owen Jones about whether we should nationalise the entire economy.
You asked yesterday about kind of policies for the country, and you said nationalise the entire economy. So just wondering, what does that look like?
That looks like a socialist transformation of the country where we nationalise utilities, we nationalise energy, we nationalise transport, we nationalise communications, including the internet, but we also have to broaden our horizons.
But not the entire economy, though.
So we have to have a socialist economy that includes workers running their workplaces through cooperatives. It means public services run for profit, not need, with, workers and users on the boards of those organisations.
Democratic ownership.
And it means the entire economy run by workers, not the billionaires and the corporations that run it today.
So that mean I'm just interested because like kiosks, like small little cafe kiosks. That kind of
workers cooperatives.
Yeah. So I don't know. I'm just interested because you said the entire. I'm just trying to. I think it's fascinating.
The entire economy under the control of workers.
Okay.
Whether that is nationalisation, workers' cooperation.
Socialisation.
And when we look at especially things like food, that means looking at the entire food production system and that being under the control of workers.
So as I was saying, there were loads of discussions this week about whether that was a strategic or tactical thing for someone to say if they want to get elected. I want to park that question because I don't think it's the most interesting one to have. I think a more interesting question is whether what Zarah suggested there is actually a good idea. Whether having the whole economy under workers' control and not having private businesses alongside the public sector is a good idea. Interestingly, there was also a division online this week between two figures on the left that actually surprised me. I wouldn't have guessed this. The first was Tariq Ali. So you've probably heard of Tariq Ali. He's as close as you get to Marxist royalty in Britain. He was one of the leaders of the anti-Vietnam movement in 1968, very closely associated with the New Left Review. So this was his tweet in response. Well-meaning but pure rhetoric. Both Ben and Livingston had some very good socialist economists working for them who came up with credible plans. The entirely nationalised economies in the former Soviet Union and China, Cuba too, simply did not work. We had huge debates on this within the global left. Zarah has to get some help on this one. What she's saying will be laughed at, and understandably. Given the experiences of the 20th century, we know this type of maximalism destroys economies. It should be debated in open and comradely fashion. I groaned when I first heard her saying this. So it's very, very interesting. Tariq Ali saying not just that this is an unstrategic thing to say, but this kind of sort of maximalist worker ownership, full communism doesn't work. Which, as I say, I wouldn't have guessed that would have been his answer. And I wouldn't have guessed that someone who took a very different take to Tariq Ali was Bhaskar Sankara, founding editor of Jacobin magazine, good friend of the show. And just to explain the context here, so on Twitter, I'd said a video of Zoran Mamdani, which he'd made about supporting small businesses, had a better message than nationalise the entire economy. You only need to know that because that makes this tweet from Bhaskar Sankara more understandable. So Bhaskar says, 1, Zoran should make more videos about cutting red tape for small businesses. 2, he should have regular chats with Jamie Dimon about financial services jobs in the city. So Jamie Dimon, is he JP Morgan or one of those big banks? 3, if asked what full democratic socialism is, he should give an answer similar to what Zarah Sultana gave Owen. Aaron, Zarah's answer to that question created quite the storm online. And as I say, I don't want to make this about Zarah or what she said, but it has brought up a real division on people on the left and otherwise about what actually economy do people want. Do we want everything to be completely workers owned, or do they? Who does want everything to be completely workers owned? Who does think that everything should be forced to be a co-op? Who does think that there is actually a big role for private businesses that make some profits while also having a decent state sector? What's your opinion?
So I think the night before Owen spoke to Zarah, our very own Stephen Methven asked a similar question, and Zarah said that nationalise everything. That's what she said. She didn't talk about worker ownership. It's the best of my recollection. To be clear, nationalising everything under state control was dropped by Vladimir Lenin in 1921 with the adoption of the new economic policy. It was described as war communism. That was the position of war communism, 1917 to 1921. That's the idea that everything is administered centrally by the state, and it's the means of production and public ownership. It's there's a political secretariat that administers all of it.
Comes back again under Stalin for some, because the new economic policy doesn't last that long.
Yeah, right? But broadly speaking, I'm saying that Lenin basically it's associated with war.
Yeah.
Other countries have tried it as well. Then what she says there to Owen is that, yes, of course, you have public ownership for many things, especially natural monopolies, where it's exactly the same thing I just described, highly centralised. People love slagging off centralisation. I love it for some things, right? You want a centralised water system or healthcare. I don't want like a federalised, especially in a country that's small. So for some things, yes, but then for other things, other parts of the economy, she would like worker ownership. Okay, and that's more consistent with, say, the Yugoslav model under Tito. So under Tito, under Yugoslav actually existing socialism, they have markets, right? The point is that the firms in those markets are worker-owned. They have markets. They did not have markets under war communism. They did not have markets, as you say, under lots of Stalinist Russia. So those are two separate visions. I would say, first of all, I think war communism, if you're not actually in a war, is probably quite a bad idea. Generally speaking, if you collectivise food production, loads of people die. Just a fact. A historical observation. Maybe somebody will disprove it at some point. Maybe it's too soon to tell. I think markets can work. Markets can be very effective. I'm very sympathetic to that Yugoslav argument. I think as an economy, we should be bringing certain things into public ownership, like utilities, etc., rail, mail, maybe the internet too, as I write about in my book. And I think you would want to expand the worker and cooperative-owned economy as much as possible through socialised finance, right? I write about that in my book as well. I think that the size of the cooperative and worker-owned economy could be much, much bigger than it is today. Owen said, well, what about a kiosk? I mean, a kiosk is a very simple enterprise to administer. That's a classic small family business, which they could own. When you're talking about a FTSE 100 company, that's when things start to get a little bit more difficult. The Swedes had a response to that, which was the Meidner plan, where that the workers in those companies don't necessarily control them. They're one voice within the company, but they have equity within that company, which grows over time. So you're socializing the value of that company over time. Again, you still have a market system. So there's lots of ways around this. The idea that we nationalize everything, which in defense of Zarah, when she's speaking at Owen, she's not saying that. That's, I think, a bad idea. Can we adopt a radical social democracy, bring certain things into public ownership, try and expand the worker and cooperative economy? 100%. Should we be having nationally owned banks that, at a regional and a national level, give finance to workers to buy the companies they presently work for? 100%. That's not a particularly outlandish thing to say. If you look at China, for instance, some of the largest companies in China are run by the state. But also, I think any business in China with more than 9 employees has a party cell, has a Chinese Communist Party cell. So look, I'm a moderate. I'm very gradualist with this, and I've framed my views in terms of post-capitalism is going to be an outgrowth of technological changes, and I think that we need to graft onto those technological changes class power, and I frankly think that's going to happen over the next century. Do I think that communism is just, nationalise everything? No, I don't. I think that's kind of the lesson of the 20th century. Although I wouldn't want to diminish some of the very successful socialist projects of the last century. For the Soviet Union to get where it from 1917 basket case falling apart to being the first, nation state to have a man in space, a person in space, that's an extraordinary accomplishment.
Yeah, I suppose the Yugoslav example is interesting, isn't it? Because I think lots of people see it as attractive because it was sort of, you can call it communism, but it wasn't Stalinism. And obviously, Stalinism is obviously quite unattractive. But there's also lots of arguments that the Yugoslav model didn't really work very well. It brought good growth to begin with. And then I was reading a Branko Milanovic article about this, who you interviewed two weeks ago, really, really interesting thinker. He was saying it had lots of problems, right? So you had, when you had workers' co-ops, they were less likely to employ new people. Yeah. Because they prefer to raise their own wages. Not because they're selfish, just because that's what you're generally going to do. So productive businesses didn't really expand. That lowered overall productivity in the economy. And that there wasn't enough investment. And he said you ended up getting very, very high inflation, hyperinflation, I think, at some point in Yugoslavia. So I suppose I think that sometimes these arguments haven't paid enough attention to the 20th century. Like, Marx was writing when he thought social democracy wasn't really possible, right? He didn't think it made sense that you could have capitalism for a century and a half, which would have a big mixed economy where people's wages would rise consistently for a century, which is fair enough. He was writing in 1850. And I think there are still sections of the left who look at the world and say, well, we have to go for, maybe if we modified the Soviet Union a bit, maybe if we modified Yugoslavia a bit, maybe if we had the Chinese system but with democracy and free trade unions. So, like, why not just have social democracy, which worked quite well?
But hold on, that's what the Chinese did, right? They looked at the Russian model. This happens in the 60s and the 70s, and they say, okay, that doesn't work. What we're going to do is instead we're going to go for export-oriented growth, right? And we're going to learn the lesson of other East Asian economies. So I think China is a very good sort of rebuttal to this idea that you can't learn productive lessons and still, adhere to the spirit of a post-capitalist, view. I said the new economic program of Lenin after 1921. One way of looking at what China has done since Deng Xiaoping is that they are in the middle of a century, or maybe even centuries-long new economic plan, their own NEP, right? And what somebody like Deng would say, who died a committed Marxist, even though he introduced market forces to China, he made China highly integrated into the global economy. Deng would say, we need to liberate the forces of production as good Marxists, precisely in order to ascend to a higher mode of production, i.e. something beyond capitalism. I think that's kind of my view. I'm Novara's very own Dengist. But I do also think, even if you're a social democrat, no, we can't become Yugoslavia. But if you look at, for instance, the alternative models of ownership, the paper that was put out by John McDonnell as Shadow Chancellor, I think in 2017, maybe late 2016, I do think that the co-op and worker-owned economy should be, 20% of the economy. I do think that. And of course, you want strong trade unions in the private sector, 100%. And I think that's probably a very good holding position, for the rest of our lives. Sure. But it's great to have that conversation. And you are right. Another weakness, of course, of worker and co-op businesses is that they tend, in a financial crisis, because they're smaller, they're less likely to get credit from banks. So if you're a bank, you want to make one big risk. I want to give a loan of 100 million to a massive enterprise rather than give 50 loans, which add up to 100 million, to loads of little companies. So what that means over time, longitudinally, is that smaller worker-owned companies, co-ops as well, when there's a financial crisis or when there's a downturn in consumer demand, they can't access the credit that bigger private firms can access. Those private firms just gobble them up. They consolidate them. They tend towards monopoly, which again is a feature of capitalism we're all aware of. So yes, it has its problems, but I think that, between the Preston model, between public ownership of utilities, between the worker-owned economy, and learning some stuff from China too, I think the state should have equity in some private companies, for instance, in this country. It will look a hell of a lot different to what it is right now.
Do you think there's a pick and mix problem though? Because, and why I say this is because China has made, I have the utmost respect for the Chinese Communist Party. No one has lifted more people out of poverty in such a short space of time as the Chinese Communist Party. But I don't think, I think we've got a better system. I think if you can have a system like ours, it's better than the Chinese system.
In what way?
We've got decent standards of living. We've got free speech. We've got free trade unions. Like, I don't know if I'd swap what we've got.
When you say we, who do you mean?
The UK, Western Europe.
America, you could make that argument, right? We've had stagnating productivity for 17 years. We don't build enough houses.
Yeah, but but
the Chinese would say no, but you have a centralized party that they can tame capital, they can tame the rentier class precisely to serve the people. That's what they would say.
Well, I mean, housing is still housing is even more expensive in China than it is here at the moment. So they have their own dysfunctions, and they've been very good at sort of making super fast growth. Still a lot poorer than us. I just feel like I'm very much a pluralist in the sense that sort of, I think if that worked for them, great, go for it. But I think if you can have social democracy, it probably is the best system. The best argument for the CCP is that social democracy might not have worked in a country that big, which the Americans might have wanted to subvert because it's a big, powerful country and they didn't want the competition.
100%.
That's the strongest argument for the CCP. But I do think that if you can have social democracy, just go for it.
Michael Walker, you heard it here first. If you can have social democracy, go for it.
Yeah,
but look, there are lots of
That's
countries.
what I believe.
No, but there's lots of leftists who were removed by the CIA over the course of the 50s and the 60s in Guatemala, in Iran. Even Fidel and Che, like they would have been happy with social democracy. But the nutjob CIA were like, no, can't do that. Land reform, no way. You know, their politics weren't that dissimilar to many people who would have become Labour MPs in 1945. So American empire rules out social democracy for large swathes of the planet. That's why they moved towards like a pro-Soviet Union position. But also, social democracy rests on a few things which I think aren't coming back. So permanently high rates of growth. You have the one-off shift of people living in country, going to city, high fertility rates, high levels of ecological destruction. Now, I still think we should have markets, right? I still think there's some place for private firms for at least a few decades, 100%. But if you think we can go back, and I'm not saying you do think that, but if you do think we can go back to the social democracy and the improvements in living standards that you see in this country and across Europe from 1945 to the early 1970s, you're in cuckoo land, right? Because those rates were very high as a historical one-off for very, very contingent reasons, right? Loads of women entering the labour market, loads of people moving to cities, loads of gas and oil being removed from the planet and us pumping loads of CO2 into the atmosphere. So I'm not so sure. I like the idea of radical social democracy, but if you think that that's a model that can compete in the 21st century with China, I wouldn't be very optimistic.
Yeah, well, I mean, we haven't seen what happens to China when they get to our income level. I mean, it's still a much poorer country than we are, right? So I feel like the jury is very much still out. I also think that, there is an argument that sort of all of these countries could have had this great social democracy if it weren't for the CIA. Obviously, the CIA did those coups, absolutely outrageous, mass murder. At the same time, there's lots of other reasons why people moved away from import substitution. Because I suppose what I think is that Marxists systematically underestimate the dynamism of capitalism.
Really?
And overestimate.
Marx was the original dude saying capitalism is so dynamic. Well, it's so dynamic, it creates communism.
But he thought it was so dynamic, but then it would run out. It would start to, in short order, fetter the forces of production. That's why he thought that a revolution might have been a good idea at the beginning of the 20th century. And clearly it had a lot more juice, in terms of raising living standards for sort of everyone. I mean, if the 20th century, I know you did an interview with Yanis Varoufakis about this, whether the 20th century was a tragedy or a disaster. But I mean, there has never been a bigger improvement in people's material living conditions than the entire 20th century from beginning to end. So ideally social democracy, that's what you want, but that system had a lot more juice. And Marx thought that everyone was going to get, the labour share was going to constantly fall. It actually stayed steady until neoliberalism, which we're both against. I just think
find some common ground here, Michael.
It understates that, and then overstates the productivity, the non-problematic nature of the alternative. Because lots of these countries try to do import substitution. You get all of these inefficiencies in state-managed firms. Yes, you also have loads of problems in capitalism. I suppose, to link it to my former story, I think lots of people look at the world and see what they want to see, and actually it's much more complicated.
China, you're right, import substitution, people are like, yeah, this is really inefficient, which is to say that you stop importing stuff from elsewhere and you start producing all that stuff yourself. And China, to be fair to China, has basically done import substitution for a number of things, and why not? It was until very recently the largest country in the world by population, the world's largest market. It's really good, is it? Right? They make loads of stuff really quickly, really cheaply, and then their R&D gets really good, and actually all of a sudden they're the best in the world. Look at electric vehicles. So import substitution can work. The thing you said about the 20th century, and it was a great time to be around, I mean, that's just inarguable, really, of course. Could it have been better? I think so. I think it would have been nice to avoid a World War or two.
Could have been worse, though, but we got no idea.
True,
Could have been much worse.
Of course. But I think there's two ways of looking at it, right? One is that it was incredible, or you can say, well, actually, no, there was a revolution in technologies and ideas, and the politics fucked things up, right? The First World War, Michael, is just this What a crazy thing to be talking about on a Friday night. But the First World War...
We're both against that.
If you look at the world in 1913, Stefan Zweig talks about this, nobody thought that was even plausible. Nobody thought it was plausible. You have this incredible globalization, republic of letters across Europe, a sense of modernity and possibility probably far greater than right now. Actually, not probably, much greater than now. And within a year, people are killing each other by the hundreds of thousands in continental Europe. So on social democracy, Lenin, Michael, until 1914, Lenin called himself a social democrat, right? It's a very loose term. And you're saying pick and mix. We live in a pick and mix world, right? We have private firms, we have public ownership, we have cops, we live in that world. We have markets, we have non-markets. The family isn't a market, okay? The state often doesn't work like a market. So the thing you're saying about, I'm trying to get my train of thought back because this is key.
Yeah.
The thing you're saying about public ownership and this kind of fetish for not adhering to market systems, I kind of agree with you. I love markets, but I think you've misread Marx. Marx doesn't say that capitalism fetters the means of production. It's the institutions which capitalism creates which fetter the means of production. Capitalism itself is constantly revolutionizing. They're constantly trying to make money, look at those crazy people with betting markets. These nut jobs are constantly trying to make more money. AI, robotics, the space race, that's capitalism. But at the same time, capitalism also means you have Google has to make its searches shit because the more searches, the more ad revenue. So they've had to make their own product worse. That's capitalism, right? On a twin track, you've got robots on the one side and you've got companies literally trying to make their own cornerstone products worse every year so that you can waste more time looking at their adverts. That's capitalism. And Karl Marx was saying, can we do something better than that? I think we can. Let's get rid of the rentierism, Michael.
Well, get rid of the rentierism. I'm quite into Henry George at the moment. Let's go to a blast from the past. This is Jeremy Corbyn when he was Labour leader speaking to the CBI.
What's your view of people personally doing well financially from businesses they start, found, grow, or lead?
No, I don't have a problem with people doing well at all. Indeed, I work with and know many people in my own community and other places that do set up and establish small businesses, and sometimes they grow to be considerably bigger. They all go through the pain of trying to get a premises, if they're making things or selling things, trying to borrow the money to do it, trying to fix it up and all that to get started. And they work incredibly hard and they do take huge personal risks to achieve it. Some fall by the wayside and those businesses don't make it. Others do very well. I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem at all with that, quite the opposite. It's actually the dynamic that's brought about much of the technical and economic development we've got in this country. But two things need to happen. One is those innovative, creative people that have designed so much of the high technology we've got need support to do it and need access to appropriate funding to get their businesses going. And if they do become incredibly rich, then I invite them to be happy with their wealth, but also to share it a bit by paying their taxes as appropriately so that our public services are there for them just as much as they're there for everybody else, so that we don't have this horribly divided society. I don't think any of us want to walk past rough sleepers on the way into our businesses every day. What we want to do is walk into our businesses knowing that we have a society that does care for the very vulnerable and those that have suffered all kinds of catastrophes in their lives. That makes for a happy society. Many, I'm sure, in this room give and support charities in lots of ways and give lots to their community, and I thank businesses for that. But it's also important that we do have properly funded public services to make sure those services are there for all time.
There's just someone questioning that is housing expensive in China. In Beijing, the house price to income ratio is 37. So we think it's high in London, it's about sort of 10 to 15, 37. In Shanghai, it's similar. So, like, the idea that, oh, they've just got it right. Like, they have their own dysfunctions. Anyway, Corbyn there, that was just very bog standard. Business is fine, but pay your taxes. We'll support you to get rich and bring about the innovations that are going to help support society, but we want you to pay your taxes. What's wrong with that?
Sounds great. Corbyn, do we agree, Michael? Corbyn with FT characteristics. Look, I think it sounds great, and that's what we should be doing. We can expand the worker-owned economy. We can expand the part of the economy. We should bring certain things into public ownership, and there should be expectations about private industry. What Branko Milanovic says about China is it's political capitalism. He's not saying it's communism, because, by the way, it's not communism. It's political capitalism, which is to say, and Eric E. Lee also has a great line on this, in the West, you can change parties, but you can't change policies. In China, you can change policies, but you can't change the party. And I find that a really interesting provocation. And they can change policies precisely because the party is in charge of capital, right? The party can determine resource allocation, what you want to research more generally, and that's the point of the 5-year plans. Now, you might say as a Social Democrat, I don't want to do that, but I'm pretty sure you'd say, I would quite like a little bit more leadership from a democratically elected state, right, in terms of the long-term objectives and ambitions of the wider economy. That would be a good thing, right? Maybe Michael Walker might even argue for 5-year plans.
I would love a 5-year plan. But to be honest, I suppose one thing I do think, when I was saying pick and mix, obviously I'm up for mixing markets with this. Like, I want a mixed economy. That's the whole point of social democracy, is to have a mixed economy. I suppose the point I'm making is the positive things that you see in China might necessitate the bad things that you see in China. So, for example, I think commanding the heights of the economy would probably be quite difficult in a multi-party system. Like, a big problem the NHS has is that it's state managed, state governed, but the parties change every 5 to 10 years, which means they don't really have much incentive to do long-term planning. So I think there's a reason why state capitalism seems to work best in relatively authoritarian systems. Because if you have the parties constantly changing, then it's very difficult for that to function in the kind of long-term manner that it needs to.
I'm a PR guy.
Yeah, I mean, that's the...
You can have stability with PR as well, right? Because you broadly have the same parties involved and nobody can... I blame the other guy. Well, hold on. You were in coalition with us. You can have long-term planning, 20, 25 years, which we don't have in this country.
That's the German model. You've got some workers on boards.
Obviously, although they really screwed it with nuclear, Michael.
I don't think you should throw out a whole system because they got nuclear wrong.
It's one mistake.
Let's wrap up. I love having you in the studio here with me.
It was great fun, Michael.
I feel like our conversations are going to get much deeper.
There was a really
Hopefully you like that. Oh, you want to go to some comments?
Can I read one comment?
Yes, please do.
I would never read a comment just because it's nice about me, but it was nice about me. This was from Plain Talk Videos 9043. I love Aaron being in the studio. And Michael, before you think I'm being sort of, obsessed with myself, Atlas can take it. This conversation format is so much better. Seriously.
I was just going to prove. I was just proving that we are actually in the same room, because there are a lot of comments saying that maybe we're making it up. But yeah, we're right. You see my hand there? Back here, this is amazing, isn't it? What, this is incredible.
Imagine if you were doing that and we weren't in the same room.
Yeah, that would be even
that is
more
the level
impressive.
of the rig, right? It's been screwing up so much because it's so good. It is amazing. It hasn't been screwing up. I shouldn't say that.
We're going to
Tremendous job from our production team.
We're going to get a wide camera at some point as well, so that it will be even more evidence that we're in the same room. Aaron, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Michael. And again, a shout out to the guys behind the scenes. We've had real teething problems. I shouldn't overemphasize it. It never happened. Let's be good communists. It never happened. Forget it. Doctor the photos. We had our teething problems, but
that's what you can do when there's no real accountability. You just say what your superiors want to hear.
Sounds good. Those shows never happened. I'm really grateful for those guys and our supporters as well to make this happen. Next year, Michael, this show is going to another level.
Someone's saying, sorry, Michael, you need to do some research. E.g. in Cuba, home ownership is 90%. Yeah, but I mean...
True. True.
Why?
Vietnam, true. Yeah, Romania, Eastern Bloc, true.
The Dominican Republic is just a lot richer than Cuba now. Anyway, this would be a whole, like, obviously I'm really one of those guys who is very against people who say, like, oh, Cuba, this totalitarian hellhole. Great things about Cuba.
Mojitos.
But I find it strange when people living in a successful social democracy sort of feel like, oh, I'd swap that for Cuba. Anyway, let's wrap up. We'll be back on Monday for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.